Forget the whispers of treason, the silent prayers for deliverance, or the frantic scuffling of heirs apparent. The most insidious, unspoken horror of Henry VIII's final days wasn't plotted in shadowy corners or declared in defiant proclamations. No, this terror was elemental, an invisible siege laid upon Whitehall Palace by the king himself. It was the stench, a miasma of grotesque decay, so potent, so profoundly offensive, it became more than just a symptom of a dying monarch. It was a political force, a daily assault on the senses of everyone who dared enter his orbit, a silent testament to the utter, abject failure of a body that had once been the symbol of England's virile power. While your reference script vividly details the ulcers and the king's immense suffering, it doesn't fully capture the olfactory warfare that defined his final months. How the very air around the king became a tool of subjugation, a constant, sickening reminder of mortality that no amount of incense or perfumed leather could truly conquer. We'll explore how this pervasive rot wasn't just a private agony, but a public spectacle of disintegration that profoundly impacted court life, a detail often glossed over in favor of the more conventional political intrigues. By January 1547, the once athletic, bluff King Hal was a prisoner in a mountain of his own flesh, estimated by some to be tipping the scales at nearly 400 pounds. His famous legs, once powerful enough to command a war horse or dance the night away, were now his greatest tormentors. Riddled with chronic weeping ulcers, likely varicose ulcers, hideously inflamed and infected, possibly burrowing down to the bone due to osteomyelitis, they emitted a stench so overpoweringly foul that even hardened courtiers, men accustomed to the battlefield's gore, struggled to maintain their composure. This wasn't just an unpleasant odor. It was the smell of putrescence, of necrotic tissue, a scent that clung to fabrics, permeated corridors, and announced the king's agonizing presence long before he was seen. Accounts speak of attendants needing to hold perfumed cloths to their vases, of windows being flung open even in the bitter cold of winter, a desperate and often futile attempt to ventilate the royal sick room. The king, a man obsessed with majesty and control, was now in a deeply visceral way, befouling his own sacred space. The reference script mentions mechanical devices to move him, but consider the grim reality of these contraptions. These weren't sleek, modern aids. They were likely cumbersome, creaking wooden hoists and specially reinforced chairs, requiring teams of strong servants to operate. Each movement, however slight, would have sent jolts of unimaginable pain through Henry's ulcerated limbs, often causing the wounds to seep afresh, intensifying the horrifying smell. The sheer manpower and logistical effort dedicated to managing the king's decaying body was immense. Grooms of the stool, once prestigious positions, now undertook tasks of unimaginable unpleasantness, cleaning not just the king but the soiled, linens and chambers, fighting a losing battle against the tide of his physical collapse. Imagine the psychological toll on these individuals, trapped in close proximity to this suffering, breathing in the constant odor of death, all while maintaining the elaborate charade of royal deference. And what of Henry himself? A man of immense pride. How did he cope with this ultimate humiliation? Did he rage at his helplessness, at the betrayal of his own body that now produced such revulsion? Or did a fog of pain, opiates, and possible cognitive decline insulate him from the full horror of his condition? While the reference notes his rages, the specific shame of his own scent, his awareness of the reactions of those around him, is a dark, unexplored corner of his psyche. He had once been the epitome of Renaissance kingship, a paragon of masculine vigor. Now, the very air he displaced was a testament to his decay. This sensory assault was relentless. Beyond the smell, there were the sounds. The king's groans of pain, his labored wheezing breaths, the hushed, fearful whispers of his attendants, the constant, unsettling squelch of poultices being applied and removed. These poultices, as mentioned in the reference, were desperate concoctions, boiled onions, powdered human skull, but their inefficacy only highlighted the grim reality. The royal physicians, like Dr. George Owen and Dr. Thomas Wendy, were powerless, their knowledge insufficient to combat the systemic infections and metabolic diseases raging within the royal patient. They could only try to mask the symptoms, to offer fleeting comfort with draughts of alcohol laced with opium, which in turn further clouded his mind and judgment. The cost of this round-the-clock, intensive, yet ultimately futile care must also be considered, not just in monetary terms, drawing on an already strained treasury, but in the emotional and physical expenditure of his court. The king's sick room became the grotesque heart of the kingdom, a place from which power still ostensibly flowed, but which was, in reality, a charnel house in waiting. This focus on the pervasive, inescapable sensory horror and its impact on the court's daily life and psychological state is a dimension of Henry's final days that demands deeper exploration beyond the catalogue of his illnesses. While the stench of decay, as we've explored, choked the corridors of Whitehall, an even more suffocating atmosphere permeated the court. The silence. Not the respectful hush of a solemn sick room, but a weaponized silence, a carefully constructed void where truth about the king's deteriorating condition was the most dangerous contraband imaginable. For in Henry VIII's dying days, knowledge wasn't just power, it was survival, and the manipulation of what was known, and more importantly, what wasn't, became a terrifying game of life and death played out around his festering throne. The reference script alludes to the closely guarded secret of his health and the politics of succession, but it barely scratches the surface of the information warfare waged by those closest to the crown, a battle where a misplaced word could mean the Tower, and control over the king's ear, however deafened by pain and opiates, was the ultimate prize. This wasn't merely about managing public perception, it was about actively shaping the dying king's reality, influencing his final, fatal decisions, and ensuring that only one version of events, the version that served the ascendant faction, would prevail. The men who controlled access to Henry's increasingly isolated sick room, figures like Sir Anthony Denny, his chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and Sir William Paget, his principal secretary, became the de facto gatekeepers of the kingdom. They decided who saw the king, what news reached him, and crucially, what orders emerged under his trembling, guided hand. The reference script mentions his signing execution orders while struggling to hold a pen. This image is central. Imagine the scene. The immense, groaning king, his mind clouded by agony and drugs, presented with documents by men whose own futures and the future of England hung on his enfeebled scrawl. The potential for manipulation was enormous. The dry stamp, a facsimile of Henry's signature used by trusted counselors to authorize documents, became an object of immense power and even greater suspicion in these final months. While intended for convenience, its use when the king was barely lucid blurred the lines between his will and the will of those around him, particularly the reformist faction coalescing around Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. The conservative faction, led by Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and his son Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, found themselves increasingly shut out, their access limited, their influence waning as the king's physical defenses crumbled, mirroring the collapse of their political standing. This carefully managed information vacuum bred a terrifying paranoia that seeped into every stone of Whitehall. Courtiers learned to read the most subtle signs, the demeanor of physicians emerging from the royal chamber, the frequency of hushed conferences, the sudden summons of certain councillors to speak openly of the king's imminent death was tantamount to treason. Imagining the king's death was a capital offense. This forced a grotesque pantomime of optimism where courtiers were expected to inquire after the king's health with feigned hope, even as the evidence of his decay was an open secret. The air crackled with unspoken anxieties and furtive glances. Gossip, always rife at court, took on a desperate, dangerous edge, as whispers could make or break careers, or even lives. Henry himself, his legendary temper exacerbated by pain and illness, was more suspicious than ever. He reportedly railed against perceived slights and conspiracies, his judgment warped, making him dangerously suggestible to those who had his ear. The reference notes his vacillation between religious positions. This too could have been influenced by who was present, guiding his theological reflections or exploiting his spiritual fears. Consider the precarious position of his sixth wife, Catherine Parr. The reference script mentions her being kept at a distance during critical periods, but her role was far more complex and perilous. A woman of keen intellect and known reformist sympathies, she had already narrowly escaped a plot to brand her a heretic, orchestrated by the conservative faction just a year earlier. She had saved herself then through shrewd submission and a display of wifely devotion. Now, as Henry faded, she was his primary nurse, tending to his repulsive ailments with a fortitude that amazed many. Yet, she walked a razor's edge. Any perceived attempt to influence him, particularly on matters of religion or the succession of her beloved stepchildren, Elizabeth and Edward, could have been twisted by her enemies. She had to provide comfort without appearing to control, to show concern without revealing the true hopelessness of his state. Her quiet influence in promoting a Protestant education for Edward and Elizabeth was a long game, but in these final days, her priority was survival. His, for as long as possible, and her own in the power vacuum that would inevitably follow. The reference notes Henry's will meticulously laid out the succession. What it doesn't fully detail is the intense lobbying and maneuvering that likely occurred before that will was finalized, with Catherine Parr subtly advocating for her stepchildren's inclusion and rights amidst the wolves of the court. The final brutal acts of Henry's reign, such as the attainder and condemnation of the Duke of Norfolk and the execution of his son, the Earl of Surrey, in January 1547, mere days before Henry's own death, are stark examples of this manipulated environment. Surrey's crime was, in part, foolishly quartering the royal arms with his own, an act of hubris easily fanned into treason in the paranoid atmosphere. Norfolk, the Premier Duke of England, was saved from the block only by the king expiring hours before his scheduled execution. These actions effectively decapitated the conservative Catholic faction, clearing the path for the Seymours. How much of this was Henry's clear, unadulterated will, and how much was skillfully presented to a dying, pain-racked monarch by those who stood to gain the most? The answers remain shrouded in the deliberate ambiguity of those last, desperate days, where the king's voice, once a roar that shook Europe, became a fading whisper, easily lost or manipulated amidst the clamor for power. The true terror lay not just in the king's physical suffering, but in the silent, ruthless exploitation of his decline. As Henry VIII's colossal frame succumbed to its myriad infections, and his mind became a battleground of pain and paranoia, an extraordinary, almost theatrical production was underway within the walls of Whitehall. This wasn't just about suppressing news of his decline, as we've discussed. It was about actively, and with increasing desperation, projecting an illusion of continued royal vitality and control, even as the man himself was dissolving. The reference script touches upon royal proclamations describing Henry as hale and hearty, but it doesn't fully convey the sheer, almost surreal theatricality of maintaining this facade. This was a macabre pageantry, a meticulously choreographed denial of death, where the symbols of kingship were wielded with frantic energy to mask the horrifying reality. We're not just talking about carefully worded dispatches. We're delving into the rituals, the public appearances, however brief and managed, and the desperate attempts to maintain the aura of the all-powerful monarch, even as the stench of his decay belied every ceremonial gesture. Imagine the sheer effort involved in presenting the king to any but his most intimate circle. By late 1546, moving Henry was a monumental task. The reference notes mechanical devices, but the physical reality of hoisting, carrying, and positioning a nearly 400-pound man, whose every touch could elicit screams of agony from his ulcerated legs, was a grim daily struggle. Yet the pretense of normalcy had to be maintained. When foreign ambassadors or high-ranking nobles were granted carefully controlled audiences, they would have encountered a meticulously staged scene. The king, perhaps propped up in his great bed or a reinforced chair, swathed in rich velvets and furs to conceal his bulk and the ravages of his illness. The lighting would be dim, the air thick with incense, not just to combat the ever-present odor, but to obscure the sickly pallor of his skin, the jaundiced eyes, the bloated distortion of his once handsome features. His voice, when he could muster it, would be weak, his pronouncements perhaps scripted or prompted by the ever-present Denny or Paget. Every such encounter was a high-stakes performance, designed to project an image of a king still in command, still capable of dispensing favor or unleashing wrath, however fleeting his lucidity. The reference mentions the Privy Council fracturing, but also consider the immense pressure on these councillors to participate in this charade. They were, in effect, actors in this royal drama. They had to report to the outside world, to Parliament, to foreign powers, that the king was well, that government continued smoothly under his direction. Documents continued to be issued in his name, bearing his stamp, maintaining the fiction of his active rule. This created a bizarre dichotomy. Within the inner sanctum, the grim reality of a dying man. Outside, the carefully polished image of the indomitable sovereign. The psychological strain of this duality must have been immense. Furthermore, the economic implications of this charade are rarely considered. Maintaining the full pomp and circumstance of the Tudor court, even around a dying king, was incredibly expensive. The lavish spending on Henry's household, his doctors, his elaborate attempts at comfort, and the ongoing projection of royal magnificence continued unabated, draining a treasury already depleted by wars and extravagance. This financial burden would be a significant, though less visible, part of the terrifying legacy Henry bequeathed to his young son. Consider also the religious rituals performed around the king. The reference script notes his vacillation between Catholic and Protestant rites and his chaplain's record of nightmares. This spiritual anxiety was itself a kind of performance played out before his attendants and clergy. Archbishop Cranmer, a key figure in the reformist camp, would have been a constant presence, guiding Henry's spiritual reflections perhaps, subtly steering him towards a more definitively Protestant stance in his final pronouncements. The famous moment where Henry squeezed Cranmer's hand, interpreted as a sign of faith in Christ rather than Catholic ceremony, is a cornerstone of Protestant historiography. But this, too, occurred within the highly controlled environment of the sick room, its meaning filtered through the accounts of those present, each with their own agenda. The very act of dying for a king like Henry was not a private affair, but a public, spiritual, and intensely political statement. His final religious leanings, however muddled or manipulated, would have profound implications for the future religious settlement of England. The physical objects associated with his kingship took on heightened significance. His robes of state, his crown, his scepter, These were paraded or displayed even when the man himself was too ill to bear them. The Great Seal of England, the ultimate symbol of royal authority, continued to be applied to documents, lending them the king's power, even as his own physical power waned. This reliance on the symbols of kingship, when the substance was decaying, is a poignant testament to the Tudor understanding of monarchy. The king's body politic, his immortal royal office, was desperately trying to assert its dominance over his failing body natural. This is a deeper layer than merely keeping his illness secret. It's about the active, almost magical invocation of royal power through ritual and display, a desperate attempt to hold the encroaching chaos at bay. The reference speaks of his will, laying out the succession, but the ceremonial reinforcement of that succession, the visual transfer of authority, was just as crucial. The very fabric of the court, its daily routines, its elaborate etiquette, all became part of this elaborate stage play, designed to convince themselves and the world that the center was still holding, even as it was visibly and olfactorily falling apart. The terror here lies in the fragility of it all, the constant fear that the mask might slip, revealing the grotesque reality beneath. Henry VIII's death on January 28, 1547, wasn't an end, but a grotesque beginning. While the reference script details the suppression of the news and the challenges of his funeral, it doesn't fully explore the immediate visceral horror and the political contagion unleashed by the king's corpse itself. This wasn't just about a body decomposing with alarming speed. It was about how that decomposing body became a potent, problematic symbol, a source of both macabre fascination and acute political anxiety, its very presence threatening to destabilize. The carefully constructed transition of power. The 3-day concealment of his death was not merely a strategic delay, it was a period of almost superstitious dread, as if the sheer, overwhelming physicality of the dead king, even in silence, could still exert a malevolent influence. We're looking beyond the pragmatic consolidation of power to the psychological and symbolic impact of Henry's earthly remains, and how the battle to control his narrative intensified exponentially the moment his last breath was drawn. The reference mentions the coffin splitting and dogs licking the seepage, a truly horrific image, often cited, and one that underscores the immense challenge of dealing with such a monumental and rapidly decaying corpse. But consider the deeper implications. This incident, hastily covered up, wasn't just a practical problem, it was a profound symbolic rupture. For a king obsessed with his image, with divine right, with the majesty of his person, this was the ultimate indignity, a physical manifestation of his mortality that defied all attempts at regal presentation. The embalmers, as noted, faced a Herculean task, battling the advanced putrefaction caused by his systemic infections and immense body mass. The sheer volume of spices, unguents, and lead required to contain the decaying monarch speaks volumes. His internal organs, described as diseased, would have been particularly problematic, requiring careful removal and separate treatment, a grim testament to the excesses that had defined his later life. The royal plumbers and carpenters who constructed and reinforced his massive, lead-lined coffin were dealing with an unprecedented engineering challenge, a final, morbid reflection of the king's larger-than-life persona. The 3-day period of secrecy, while Edward Seymour consolidated his power as Lord Protector, was a time of intense, behind-the-scenes activity, but also of palpable fear. Whitehall Palace, where the enormous corpse lay, became a place of hushed dread. Servants whispered of ill omens, of the unnatural silence from the king's chambers, of the lingering, sickly sweet smell that even death could not immediately dispel. This period wasn't just about political maneuvering, it was about managing the immediate physical fact of the dead king. Who was allowed near the body? How was the ongoing decay managed? What rituals, if any, were performed in secret before the public announcement? These details, often lost to history, would reveal much about Tudor attitudes towards death, contagion, both physical and political, and the almost supernatural power attributed to the royal person, even in demise. The reference mentions young Edward VI's detached journal entry, but the fear among the court officials responsible for the body would have been far from detached. Any mishandling, any perceived disrespect, could have had dire consequences, both politically and, in the superstitious mindset of the age, spiritually. Furthermore, the king's death unleashed a torrent of prophecies, rumors, and anxieties throughout the realm that went far beyond court circles. The reference touches on parish records and omens, but the scale of this popular reaction is often underestimated. For nearly 4 decades, Henry had been the sun around which England revolved. His death was not just a political event. It was a seismic shift in the natural order of things for many ordinary people. Ballads, pamphlets, and street corner orators would have dissected the meaning of his passing, interpreting it through the lens of religious turmoil and social unrest. Was his agonizing death a divine judgment for the break with Rome, or a martyr's suffering for establishing England's religious independence? These competing narratives began to circulate immediately, fueled by the vacuum of official information and the deep anxieties about the future under a boy king. The contagion of chaos wasn't just political, it was ideological, spreading through the populace as different factions sought to interpret Henry's legacy to their advantage. The will, as the reference script explains, laid out the succession, but its contents immediately became a battleground. While Henry intended a Council of 16 to rule collectively, this was, as we know, swiftly overturned by Seymour. But the legal and theological challenges to the will itself are often overlooked. Questions about Henry's mental competence in his final days, the influence of the dry stamp, and the legitimacy of his later marriages and thus the claims of Mary and Elizabeth could all be, and were by some, raised. The very document intended to secure stability became a potential source of profound instability. The execution of Thomas Seymour, Edward Seymour's own brother, a few years later, for allegedly plotting to marry Elizabeth and usurp power, demonstrates how volatile the situation remained, all tracing back to the unresolved tensions and power. Plays of Henry's final days and the interpretation of his dying wishes. Finally, the ultimate fate of Henry's planned magnificent tomb, as mentioned in the reference, its incompletion, and the eventual melting down of its bronze figures, is a poignant symbol of the limits of even a king's power to control his posthumous image. He envisioned an eternal monument to his glory, but the realities of finance, changing political tides, and the English Civil War reduced his grand design to a simple slab next to Jane Seymour. This failure to achieve his desired memorial is a powerful counterpoint to the enduring, almost mythical image of Henry VIII that Holbein and subsequent propaganda created. The terrifying final days, the grotesque decay, the political machinations surrounding his corpse, these realities were ultimately papered over by the carefully constructed myth. Yet it is in these suppressed details, in the stench, the silence, the staged majesty, and the uncontainable chaos of his physical end, that the truest, most terrifying understanding of Henry VIII's final chapter lies. The rot, in many ways, continued to spread long after his body was interred.